When my boyfriend and I were reborn at the same time, the very first thing he did was dump me, and then turn around and propose to my fragile stepsister. All because, in our previous life, we had lived in poverty. He blamed everything on me. Emily, he had said back then, I used to live in a villa and drive sports cars. If it weren't for marrying you and falling out with my family, I wouldn't have ended up penniless, living in a rented apartment and suffering like this. You owe me for the rest of your life. You deserve to be my servant. So this time, he thought that by getting rid of me, he could finally live comfortably. What he didn't know was that in just 6 months, his family would go bankrupt. My name is Emily West. I'm an illegitimate daughter with a biased father, a hypocritical stepmother, and a weak, pretentious stepsister. I grew up struggling to survive in the cracks between them. For a long time, I thought Ryan Cooper was the gift heaven had sent to save me. He was handsome, rich, and treated me so well it made my stepsister Lily burn with jealousy. Using my father's favoritism toward her, and knowing that the Cooper family elders liked her, Lily deliberately tried to drive a wedge between me and Ryan. "Aunt Cooper," she would say softly, "I know my sister's background isn't very respectable, but she's really trying her best. She's good at making people like her. I'm different. I'm not good with words, I'm slow, and I can't hide my feelings. It's natural that Ryan likes my sister more. As long as they're happy, I don't mind." I heard her say things like that every few days. Ryan's mother already disliked me, thinking I wasn't good enough for her son, and Lily's little performance only made her despise me more. Thankfully, at that time, Ryan was unwavering. No matter how his family pressured him to break up with me and marry Lily, he never wavered. He even fought with his family for me. But the price was that my father kicked me out of the house too. I still remember that night. It was pouring rain. My father threw me out along with my luggage. Lily cried in our stepmother's arms, pretending to be heartbroken, while my stepmother held her close, sobbing as if she were the one being wronged. My father didn't care who was right or wrong. He just pointed at my face and yelled, "Emily West, your sister has always been frail since she was little. She finally met someone she liked, and you had to steal him from her. Have you no shame? Ever since you were a child, you've bullied her, stealing her toys, tearing her dresses. I only let it go because your mother died early and no one disciplined you, but this time you've gone too far." But the truth was, it was Lily who had stolen toys and torn dresses. Yet after passing through my stepmother's lips, the story always became me bullying her. My stepmother was a master manipulator. Right on cue, she began to comfort my father. "James, don't be so harsh on Emily. You'll only hurt her feelings." But the more she tried to soothe him, the angrier he got. "If you hadn't spoiled her all these years, she wouldn't be this ungrateful. You made her this way." Hearing that, my stepmother cried even harder. In the end, my father forced me to make a choice: either give Ryan up to Lily, or get out of the house. I left without hesitation. I'll admit, eloping with Ryan was partly out of spite. But I never imagined that once we left the Cooper family, Ryan would turn into such a useless mess. After being cut off financially, he found the novelty of living in a small rental apartment exciting at first. He pitied me for working days and nights at 2 jobs and would comfort me, saying, "Emily, I'm sorry you're going through all this. Trust me, I'll find a good job soon and give you a better life." But 2 months passed, and he was still lying around at home without a hint of shame. Every job interview ended with excuses. It either didn't match his status, or the work environment was terrible. Eventually, he got addicted to video games, chasing validation in a virtual world while our real lives fell apart. He refused to share any housework, and to make things worse, he even demanded that I hire a housekeeper to take care of him. Gradually, he started finding fault with everything I did. "Emily, why are you making potatoes and tomatoes again? Tomorrow buy some king crab and steaks. Look at me, I'm starving myself thin. Emily, when did you get so sloppy? Your pajamas are all pilled, why don't you change them? You used to never be like this. Babe, the game just released a new skin. Transfer me $5,000, will you? I need the full set to save face." I finally snapped. Seeing Ryan sprawled on the couch, playing games, I lunged, snatched his phone, and hurled it to the floor so hard the screen shattered. I stamped and screamed like a madwoman, Ryan, are you a parasite? You have hands and feet. Why can't you go out and get a job? Can't you feel how exhausted I am every day? I work during the day, do the housework at night, and still have to take on extra shifts late into the night. I barely get 4 hours of sleep. Am I made of iron? How many times have I told you, when I go shower, hang the laundry? Yet when I come out, the clothes are still in the washer, and you're sitting there playing games. I tell you to put your dirty socks and clothes in the bathroom. When have you ever listened? You toss things everywhere. I ask you to wash the dishes before I go to work, but when I come home, the sink is piled high. The coffee table is covered in takeout boxes. Ryan, I'm a person, not your free maid or ATM. He played the victim instead. Emily, you finally show your true colors. My mom always said girls like you, illegitimate daughters, only have their eyes on my money. I didn't believe it before, and I even defended you. You only started clinging to me after you found out I had no money left. I was blind to be fooled by you. Emily, I'll tell you straight. I, Ryan Cooper, was born to live a good life. If I hadn't been unlucky enough to meet you, would I be suffering like this? What's wrong with having you wait on me? You owe me. You're supposed to be my servant. If I'd known you'd turn out like this, I should have listened to my mother and married your sister instead. I bit my lip, eyes bloodshot, hands trembling, and slapped him hard. Ryan froze, his face twisted, then didn't move for a long moment. Fighting back a sob, I asked in a shaking voice. So Ryan, do you really think life turned out like this all because of me, and not because you lack responsibility and backbone? Do you really believe Lily would be better than me? Ryan yelled at me. Lily is at least a legitimate heiress. She's not a gold-digging, illegitimate girl like you. But that wasn't what he had said before. He used to call me Emily, say I was one of a kind, the best girl in the world. Those words, that seemingly unwavering favoritism, had made me believe he was the only light in my gray life. I relied on him and trusted him with myself. Now, my heart was broken. I turned to leave. Ryan grabbed me urgently. The landlord came by tonight. Next month's rent is due. If you leave, at least transfer the rent to me. I completely lost control and attacked him like a lunatic, pulling and hitting. He pushed me. As I fell, I hit the corner of the coffee table with my head. Blood spilled across the floor. Ryan panicked. He helped me up and tried to press his hand against the wound to stop the bleeding. Emily, don't scare me. I didn't mean to. I'm not on purpose. Emily, please don't be hurt. When I opened my eyes again, everything had changed. I was back on the night Ryan had cut ties with his family for me, but this time he'd compromised. He agreed to break up with me and marry my stepsister, Lily. How wonderful. Finally, I wouldn't have to be tangled up with this irresponsible mama's boy, but the Ryan in this moment still didn't know. In 6 months, the Cooper family would be slammed by a lawsuit over a fatal construction accident. Their reputation would collapse, the stock would plunge, and they'd be facing bankruptcy. In the last life, he gamed all day and didn't care about anything. I worried, so I didn't tell him about this. His imagined good life was about to end. The first thing Ryan did after cutting ties was send me a message to break up, afraid I'd cling to him. News that the Coopers were tying the knot with the Westies spread quickly through our circle. My stepmother couldn't stop smiling. She was busy every day taking Lily out to pick jewelry and wedding gowns. From what I knew of Lily, she didn't necessarily love Ryan. She simply couldn't stand to see me do well. Besides, the Coopers really were richer than the Westies, so she was climbing up the social ladder. At several dinners, Lily deliberately showed off, both openly and subtly. Aunt Cooper was unbearably doting toward her. The day I've waited for is finally here. We're finally bringing her into our family, she said, and even my father was all smiles, praising Lily as a charming girl and saying the Cooper family had gotten a steal. Only my stepmother tried to comfort me. Emily, don't overthink it. Your sister's always been like this, can't keep things to herself. She's not doing it to hurt you, she's just happy. I chewed my food and pretended not to hear them. My reunion with Ryan took me by surprise. That night I went with my boss to a high-end club to entertain clients. On the way to the restroom, I passed a private room with the door ajar and froze at a familiar voice. Ryan had clearly slipped back into his spendthrift lifestyle. One of the bottles the server had brought in was priced at 80,000. Laughter and lewd banter spilled through the crack in the door. A drunken voice asked Ryan, "Man, we don't get it. Why'd you all of a sudden settle down and pin things on Miss West? Weren't you head over heels with that shoe ruin, Emily, before? Weren't you gonna marry no one but her?" Ryan lounged on the sofa, lazily swirling his glass of red wine. "It was just youthful ignorance," he said. "I mistook novelty for love." He tilted his head up, his eyes were sharp and calculating. "The Cooper family's standing. An illegitimate daughter can't reach that. I can't let people laugh at my family and make us bow our heads for life. I was foolish before. Now I know what I want and who I want to marry." He took a sip, and his tone grew more contemptuous. "Besides, someone like her, fine for a fling maybe, but who would actually marry her? You get me, right? This is the reality." Someone started jeering approval. Another voice, laced with a lecherous chuckle, leaned in. "But seriously, Ryan, Emily's got the looks and the figure. If you don't want her, when's it convenient to set your brother up with her?" I couldn't help the sting in my chest when they spoke of me like I was property. Ryan's expression barely flickered. He waved them off. "Come on, man. If she's leftover material, take her. I'll introduce you to some fresh, decent girls later." Even though I had long given up on him, hearing him say that still hurt. The topic shifted. "Hey Ryan, heard Ethan Fu's back in town. That guy never got along with you, and I hear his family's pushing him into marriage hard." Someone added with a sneer. "The Fu family's top of the line, powerful in High City, but Ethan Fu's a notorious rake. He's into everyone, and spends like crazy. Who would dare marry a decent daughter off to him? By the way, rumor has it Ethan Fu once courted Lily and got rejected, so your wedding has to be spectacular. Show him up. Kill his pride a little." I'd heard the name Ethan Fu before. Ryan had brought him up more than once, always with annoyance mixed with bitterness. Ethan Fu was like a mountain Ryan could never climb. In family status, looks, and ability, he overshadowed Ryan at every turn. Wherever Ethan Fu was, Ryan Cooper could only ever be a supporting role. Still, a man like Ethan falling for someone like Lily? I didn't buy it for a second. But speaking of Ethan, something suddenly came to mind. My mother, when she was alive, had been a well-known painter. Her art sales had helped fund my father's business ventures. Her favorite piece, Spring Dawn, had recently been auctioned off to Ethan Fu for a high price. Unfortunately, since he'd been living abroad, I hadn't been able to reach him despite many attempts. As fate would have it, that very night, when I left the restroom, I ran right into Ethan standing by the door, talking on the phone. He was turned slightly away from me, tall and composed, his voice laced with frustration and defiance. "Listen carefully, old man," he said coldly. "If you keep forcing me to meet those women you picked out, I'll go register my marriage with the first woman I find on the street tomorrow. Let's see if the Fu family will accept that daughter-in-law." So the rumors were true. The relationship between father and son in the Fu family was hostile, and Ethan was being forced into arranged dates. He hung up abruptly and turned around, almost crashing right into me. His brows arched slightly, surprise flickering in his eyes. I steadied myself, suppressing the rush of emotions inside, and forced a calm smile. Stepping forward, I politely extended my hand. "Mr. Fu, hello. My name is Emily West, daughter of the West family. I'm sorry I accidentally overheard your call." Ethan didn't move. His sharp fox-like eyes swept over me slowly, assessing from head to toe. I chose my words carefully and continued, "I heard you're looking for a girlfriend to deal with your family's pressure. Would I do?" He seemed intrigued, the corner of his mouth curling into a half smile. "We could sign an agreement," he said lazily. "You can decide how long it lasts. I promise I won't bother you afterward, nor ask for any money. Everything can be put clearly in writing." My tone stayed calm and detached, as if we were discussing a business deal that had nothing to do with me. Ethan gave a low, amused laugh and suddenly stepped closer. His presence was overwhelming. I instinctively tried to back away, but my heels hit the cold wall. He leaned in, one arm braced casually on each side of me, trapping me in a space both intimate and dangerous. "You said your name is Emily West?" he drawled, his voice rich, laced with danger. "Then what's your relationship with Lily West?" His question caught me off guard. Did he really pursue her once? "Lily is my half-sister," I answered truthfully, feeling my pulse tighten. Ethan's eyes darkened with something unreadable, his smirk deepening. He leaned in even closer, his warm breath brushing my cheek. "So, you're the illegitimate daughter of the West family." His words were blunt, almost cutting. My stomach dropped. That old familiar sting of humiliation crawled up again. I turned my head slightly, disheartened. "If my background makes you uncomfortable, Mr. Fu, then I—" "Quite the opposite," he interrupted smoothly. "I like your background just fine." He closed the distance further, his arms tightening around me, effectively caging me in. His gaze was predatory, sliding from my eyes down to my lips, lingering there for a moment before rising again with a teasing smile. "But Miss West," he murmured, his tones slow and taunting, "you've probably heard my reputation. I'm not exactly a gentleman. If you want to be my girlfriend, even in name only, you'll have to give something in return, right?" My fingers curled tightly into my palms. He noticed the small, involuntary stiffness in my posture, a glint of amusement flashing in his eyes. His tone shifted, sharp and probing. "So," he said, a smirk tugging at his lips, "what exactly do you want from me, going in such a big circle to get here? What's your real motive?" Ethan's deep eyes locked onto mine, sharp enough to see straight through every defense I might have tried to put up. I knew there was no point pretending with someone like him. It was better to be honest. "I want one of your paintings," I said quietly. "Spring Dawn." I paused, swallowing the lump in my throat. It was one of my mother's works. I know it's valuable, and I can't afford it right now, so I'm asking that, during the time we cooperate, you keep it safe for me. Don't sell it. When I have the means, I'll buy it from you at market price. Ethan's brows lifted higher, as if he hadn't expected that answer. "That's all? That's all," I said simply. Just then his phone rang again. He let go of me, answered briefly, then hung up and turned his gaze back to my face. Lifting his hand, he caught my chin lightly between his long fingers. The touch wasn't rough, but the control behind it was absolute. "Miss West," he said, his lips curling into a faint, teasing smile, "once the deal's done, Spring Dawn is yours, but in exchange." His tone turned casual, almost lazy, yet the authority in it was undeniable. "You'll marry me." On paper, my breath hitched. "If you agree," he added, that faint smile still tugging at the corner of his mouth, "bring your ID to the registry office at 9 tomorrow morning." I had never imagined marriage could happen like that. So sudden, so absurd, almost like a joke. When we stepped out of the registry office the next day, my head was still spinning. It felt unreal, like I'd wandered into someone else's life. Then a black Rolls-Royce stopped in front of me. The driver quickly got out and opened the rear door with a respectful bow. He looked toward Ethan. "Mr. Fu, the vice chairman just called. Madam said you must attend tonight's business reception on time." Ethan was looking down at his phone, idly scrolling. Without raising his head, he gave a low hum in response, as if that alone counted as acknowledgement. The driver hesitated, then turned toward me. "Miss West." Ethan interrupted before he could finish. "Call her Mrs. Fu from now on." His tone was casual, but it left no room for argument. The title hit me like a small stone dropped into calm water. My heart rippled. I unconsciously tightened my grip on the marriage certificate in my hand. Ethan finally put his phone away and turned to me. The sunlight cut along his sharp jawline, making his features even more striking. "Let old Chen take you to get your hair and makeup done. And pick out something decent to wear. You'll attend the dinner with me tonight." By the time I arrived at the banquet hall that evening, Ethan still hadn't shown up. I planned to find a quiet corner to stay out of the way, but fate had other ideas. I walked straight into the last people I wanted to see: Lily and Ryan. Ryan froze when he saw me, eyes flickering for a second before he quickly looked away. Even though my marriage to Ethan was just for show, I had no intention of causing unnecessary trouble for him. I turned to leave, but Lily spotted me immediately. She slipped her arm out of Ryan's and hurried over, grabbing my wrist with exaggerated sweetness. Her voice was sugar-coated, loud enough for the nearby guests to hear. "Emily, you're here too?" she said, batting her eyes in mock innocence. "Don't tell me you found out Ryan would be attending tonight and figured out some way to sneak in just to see him? Because, as far as I know, this is an exclusive business event. You need an invitation to get in. If you didn't have one, how did you manage to enter?" Instantly, curious and judgmental gazes turned toward me, whispers rippling through the room. Lily basked in the attention, satisfied, then slipped her arm back through Ryan's and gave his sleeve a playful tug. "Ryan," she said softly, her tone a perfect mix of grievance and sweetness, "you haven't really made things clear with my sister, have you? That's why she's still clinging to you, right? But you're being unfair. After all, Emily's still my sister. We'll have to keep seeing each other, won't we? You're putting me in such a difficult position." Ryan stiffened. For a moment, hesitation flashed across his face, but under Lily's expectant gaze and the scrutiny of those around us, his expression hardened, his jaw clenched, and when his eyes met mine, they were filled with cold determination, eager to draw a line between us. He opened his mouth, his voice cutting like a blade. "Emily?" "It's over between us," Ryan said coldly, his tone sharp and final. "I hope you have some self-awareness and stop trying to get my attention in such pathetic ways." He tightened his grip on Lily's hand, as if to prove something, his voice firm and cutting. "The person I'm going to marry is Lily, so please stop this pointless obsession, otherwise you'll only make things ugly for everyone." The noise must have drawn attention because my father and stepmother hurried over. My stepmother immediately put on her usual act, eyes filled with fake pity and helplessness, as she reached for my hand. "Emily, my good girl," she began in her gentle, honeyed tone. "I know you love Ryan, and it hurts, but feelings can't be forced. Ryan and Lily love each other, and they'll be getting married soon. Listen to me. Let it go, okay? Don't make things harder for everyone. Keep your dignity, sweetheart." I yanked my hand out of her grasp, glaring at her with all the hatred that had built up for years. "You're not my mother," I spat. "My mother is dead. You people drove her to death." The room fell silent. "My mom worked herself sick, painting day and night, just to fund my dad's business," I continued, my voice shaking but loud. "He promised her that once he made money, he'd marry her. She believed him. She waited, through all the years until I turned 3, only to be diagnosed with late-stage lung cancer and find out he had already married her." I shot a trembling finger toward my stepmother. "In another city. My mom died with her eyes open, and after her death, my father took her paintings, her life's work, for profit, and only then brought me back to the West household. I was too young to understand then, but my dear stepmother," I said bitterly, "you've always worn two faces, kind in public, venomous in private. My so-called bad reputation outside, that I'm selfish, that I steal my sister's man? All your masterpiece." The murmurs started immediately. I could feel every stare cutting into me, sharp and judgmental. "So it's true," someone whispered. "That illegitimate girl really is as uncultured as they say. No respect for her elders, cursing such a kind stepmother, disgraceful." "I heard she tried to seduce her own sister's fiancé," another voice added. "Shameless." My stepmother seized the moment, pretending to wipe away tears. "Please don't say that about her," she pleaded weakly. "Emily just has a bit of a temper. She means no harm. It's my fault. I didn't teach her well." My father's face darkened. He stormed forward, grabbed my wrist roughly, and hissed under his breath, "You're a disgrace. Come outside with me." I jerked my arm free, standing tall, my voice icy. "If you have something to say it here." A vein pulsed on his forehead as his anger boiled over. "Emily West, I've tried to save face for you, but you're forcing my hand." He pointed at me, shouting for all to hear. "Ryan and Lily's marriage was arranged between our families. It's already settled. Stop wasting your time." He swept his eyes across the crowd, raising his voice even louder, as if declaring it to the world. "I don't know how you even got in here tonight, but let me make this clear. If you dare to interfere with your sister's marriage again, I will sever our relationship once and for all. From this day forward, you are no longer my daughter. You are no longer part of the West family." The coldness that flooded me was absolute, so deep it burned away every trace of pain, leaving only calm. I stared at him, then suddenly laughed, a clear, steady laugh that echoed through the now silent ballroom. "Fine," I said, raising my voice so everyone could hear. "Then let all of you be my witnesses. I, Emily West, hereby sever ties with my father, James West. From this moment on, whether the West family rises or falls, it has nothing to do with me." You ungrateful brat." My father's face flushed crimson as fury overtook him. He raised his hand high, ready to slap me. I stood my ground, glaring back at him without flinching. But just as his hand was about to strike, the heavy doors of the banquet hall burst open with a resounding crash that silenced the entire room. Every head turned toward the entrance. And there, framed by the light, Ethan Fu walked in, tall, poised, and commanding in a perfectly tailored black suit, his presence instantly swallowing the noise and tension in the air. Ethan strode into the ballroom, his long legs moving at an unhurried, steady pace. His face was calm, expressionless, but his eyes, those deep, fox-like eyes, swept across the room with a sharp, commanding presence that made people instinctively step aside. As he passed, the crowd parted on its own, leaving a clear path straight toward me. Under countless curious and astonished gazes, Ethan walked with unshakable composure until he stopped right in front of me. He didn't spare even a single glance at James West, who was still frozen awkwardly in place, his hand suspended midair from the slap he never got to deliver. Ethan took off his black suit jacket without hesitation and draped it over my trembling shoulders. His voice was low and even. "The air conditioning's too cold. You'll catch a chill wearing something this light." The entire room fell silent for a moment, then erupted in whispers of disbelief. "Did you see that? The illegitimate daughter actually has a connection with the Fu heir? Looks like young Master Fu's protecting her. Wow, Emily West really has some tricks up her sleeve. First she tangled with her brother-in-law, and now she's hooked the richest man in town. We underestimated her." The gossip was vicious and cutting, but Ethan didn't even flinch. It was as if their voices didn't exist at all. He simply reached for my hand, gently placed it on his arm, and said calmly, "Sorry I'm late." Then, without so much as a glance at my father, he led me out of that suffocating crowd. James West stood there dumbfounded, his hand still frozen midair, not knowing whether to drop it or keep it raised. My stepmother and Lily's faces were drained of color, their smiles stiff as porcelain masks. Only Ryan's hands, hanging at his sides, were clenched into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. Ethan guided me through the murmuring crowd until we reached a quiet hallway, away from all the prying eyes. I finally turned to him, my voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. F, weren't you worried that defending me so openly would hurt your reputation? To them, I'm nothing but a scandal, a nobody." Ethan glanced down at me, his lips curving into a faint, careless smile. "People can say whatever they want. It's their mouths, not mine. I don't listen to gossip. I only trust my own judgment." I looked up at his face, the clean lines of his jaw sharp beneath the light, and for a moment I couldn't help but feel that this man was nothing like the frivolous, arrogant air the rumors described. After mingling for a short while, Ethan was called away by someone from his father's side, leaving me behind with instructions to wait. But he hadn't been gone long when Ryan appeared. He stopped in front of me, eyes complicated, voice low. "Emily, we need to talk." I turned my face away, unwilling to look at him. "Do you even know who Ethan Fu is?" he pressed, his voice rising with irritation when I didn't respond. "If you're trying to make me jealous, couldn't you have picked someone better? Emily, you don't have to do this. Just because you're angry about me and Lily doesn't mean you should throw yourself at a man like him." He didn't know that I had also been reborn. Still trapped in his old perceptions, he thought I was doing all of this out of spite, trying to hurt him because he'd chosen Lily over me. Ryan's tone grew harsher, his words dripping with contempt. "Do you even realize what kind of man he is? Ethan Fu, the heir to the most powerful family in High City. He controls everything with a snap of his fingers. He could have any woman he wants. Why would someone like him ever take a girl like you seriously? You're just pretty. He's interested for now, but when he gets bored, he'll toss you aside like garbage. Emily, do you have to degrade yourself like this?" I slowly turned to face him, my expression calm and cold. "Ryan," I said evenly, my voice flat, "whatever I do has nothing to do with you. If you keep pestering me, I'll call security. I doubt you'd want people seeing you pulling at me in public, right?" His face changed instantly. He stiffened, glanced nervously around the hall, and took half a step back. For a moment, he hesitated, cowardly. But even then, his pride wouldn't let him back down. His tone was softer now, but the bitterness still clung to his words. "Emily, you just won't listen, will you?" Ryan sneered, his tone dripping with contempt. If you're so determined to throw yourself into the fire, then fine, I'll wait and watch how you end up. I'll see how long it takes before you're crying and begging for help. But to me, he, Ryan, was the real fire pit. Staying far away from him in this life was the smartest thing I could ever do. I waited for a long time, but Ethan still hadn't returned. Just as I began to wonder if I should go look for him, a well-dressed, middle-aged man approached me. He introduced himself politely as the Fu family's butler. "Miss West, Mr. Fu would like to see you." He led me into a private elevator that took us to the top floor. A plush carpet ran down the quiet hallway, leading to an ornate wooden door. Just as we reached it, the sound of shattering glass erupted from inside, followed by an angry roar. "Ethan Fu, are you determined to drive me to my grave before you'll stop?" A man's furious voice bellowed. "Fine, I'll admit it. I wronged your mother first. It's my fault she died, leaving you without a mother. But that's no excuse for your reckless behavior now. Marrying an illegitimate girl just to disgust me? How far will you go?" Only then did I realize the truth. Ethan's father had cheated on his mother and justified it as true love. The betrayal had devastated her so deeply that she developed severe bipolar disorder. When Ethan was only 3 years old, she had slit her wrists and died. And suddenly, I understood everything. The strange, dangerous excitement in Ethan's eyes when he'd learned I was an illegitimate daughter. He was using me to take revenge on his father. "Before this news spreads any further," Mr. Fu Sr. growled, his voice trembling with fury, "you're going to march straight to the Civil Affairs Bureau and divorce her. Do you hear me?" Ethan's response was a cold, disdainful laugh. "And if I refuse?" The butler knocked at that moment, then quietly opened the door and ushered me inside. The tension in the room was suffocating. Mr. Fu Sr. stood in the middle, face ashen with rage, his chest heaving. Ethan, on the other hand, leaned lazily against the sofa, exuding calm defiance. But when he saw me being led in, the smirk vanished from his face. "Who told you to bring her here?" he snapped at the butler. The butler lowered his head respectfully, glanced at the elder Fu, said nothing, and silently backed out of the room, closing the door behind him. Ethan strode over, grabbed my wrist and said sharply, "Get out." "Stay where you are," his father ordered sternly. His deep voice quivered slightly as he took a long breath, clearly struggling to contain his anger. Then his sharp gaze turned on me. "Miss West, is it?" he said in a stiff, polite tone. "I apologize for letting you witness this family matter. Because of certain disagreements between my son and me, he married you out of spite. But this marriage, without my approval, means nothing. So, I must trouble you to go to the registry office tomorrow and finalize the divorce with him." His tone was that of someone stating an absolute fact. "As for any damage this farce of a marriage has caused to your reputation or personal life, the Fu family will compensate you adequately. Name your price." Ethan spun around, his voice sharp as a whip. "I'll say this once more. Who I marry is my choice. You don't get to decide that for me. I came here today to inform you, not to ask for your permission." Mr. Fu's face went from pale to red, his chest rising and falling violently as he coughed, nearly collapsing backward onto the sofa. Just then, the door to the lounge burst open again. A well-dressed woman in elegant pearls rushed in, her face pale with worry. She didn't even look at Ethan or me. She went straight to Mr. Fu, clutching his shoulders and patting his back with trembling hands. "Ethan, please stop," she cried, her voice thick with tears. "Don't upset your father any further. The doctor said his heart can't take stress." Then she turned to Ethan, her expression pitiful, her tone pleading. "If you're angry, take it out on me. It's my fault. It's all my fault. Please, just don't make things harder for your father." I watched her carefully. Her delicate sobs, the perfectly timed tears, the gentle but manipulative look in her eyes, the fragile, submissive posture. Every detail reminded me of my own stepmother. At that moment, I finally understood Ethan's deep-seated hatred. And Mr. Fu's reaction? It was eerily, painfully similar to my father's. He gripped that woman's hand tightly, glaring at Ethan with eyes full of fury and disgust. His voice trembled with disappointment. "Don't waste your breath on him. He's a useless, ungrateful fool who'll never accomplish anything. Let him ruin himself. I'll just pretend I never had this son." I felt Ethan's hand suddenly tighten around mine, his fingers digging so hard into my skin that it hurt. His voice was cold, steeped in mockery. If that's how you feel, then there's no reason for us to ever meet again. After all, when you die, your precious younger son will be there to carry your coffin. You won't be missing me. You unfilial brat. Mr. Fu's entire body shook with rage. He snatched up the redwood cane beside him and hurled it at Ethan with all his strength. In that moment, time seemed to stretch infinitely. For an instant, I wasn't standing in that grand study. I was a child again, watching my furious father raise a book from the table and throw it at me while my stepmother watched, feigning distress. And like Ethan now, I had stood there stubbornly, refusing to move or cry, even as my heart longed for someone, anyone, to love me fairly. So when that cane came flying toward him, I moved on instinct. I tore my hand free from Ethan's grip and stepped in front of him. In saving him, I was also saving the little girl I once was. The heavy cane struck my back with a sharp, sickening thud. Pain burst through me like fire, spreading fast and hot. My body lurched forward, but before I could fall, Ethan caught me. His arms were firm yet trembling slightly, panic flashing in his eyes. He pulled me tightly into his chest, holding me as though he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. Ethan carried me all the way out of that house. The night outside blurred past the car window in streaks of light. We sat on opposite sides of the back seat, neither of us speaking. My luggage had already been moved into Ethan's home, our marital residence, as written in the agreement. We were to live together for appearance's sake. He stayed upstairs in the master bedroom. I took the guest room on the first floor. When I finally looked at myself in the mirror, a deep bruise had spread across my lower back, swollen and angry. I tried to reach around to apply ointment, but the pain was too sharp, my hands trembling uselessly. A knock came at the door. I pulled my robe tighter and opened it. Ethan stood there, tall and composed, the hallway light outlining his lean figure. In his hand was a small white tube of ointment. His gaze met mine, steady, never wandering lower. "I had the driver buy this," he said, his voice quiet but deep in the stillness of the night. "They say it works well for bruises." He paused, then added softly, "If you can't reach your back yourself, I can help." I hesitated for a moment before stepping aside to let him in. The air between us felt delicate, thick with something unspoken. I sat at the edge of the bed, turning my back to him, and gently pulled one side of my robe down to reveal the bruise. I could feel his eyes on my skin, focused, careful, but without a trace of impropriety. His fingertips, cool with ointment, moved with painstaking gentleness. Every touch was measured, deliberate, respectful. He didn't glance anywhere he shouldn't. The man behind me was nothing like the careless playboy the rumors painted him to be. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of our breathing and the soft movements of his hands. "You don't ever have to shield me again," he said quietly. I pulled my robe back up and turned to face him. "I didn't do it for you," I said evenly. "I did it for the little girl I used to be. The one no one ever protected. The one who was treated unfairly and had no choice but to stand her ground." Ethan fell silent. His eyes stayed on mine, deep and conflicted, shadows of emotions I couldn't read flickering inside them. I gave a faint, bitter smile. "I guess we're not so different, you and I. We both had fathers who chose favorites, and stepmothers who knew how to act for an audience. But at least your mother once had a name, a rightful place. My mother gave everything she had, and still died nameless. She couldn't even close her eyes in peace. And now her daughter's the bastard she left behind." My tone was deliberately light, but the bitterness in my chest ran bone deep. Ethan said nothing. He just looked at me quietly, his silence heavier than words. The wind ruffled the fringe of his hair, making the emotion in his eyes even harder to read. After that night, Ryan disappeared completely from my life. For the first time in a long while, I finally enjoyed a stretch of calm. I poured all my energy into my studio. I had loved painting since I was a child. My mother's artistic talent ran in my blood. Opening an art studio and holding exhibitions had always been my dream. In my past life, I had given it up out of financial desperation, and because of Ryan. But in this life, I was living for myself alone. Recently, one of my pieces caught the attention of a well-known collector in the industry. During an interview, he mentioned my work specifically, which brought me a wave of recognition and new opportunities. For the first time, the studio was thriving, finally finding its rhythm. Around the same time, news of Lily and Ryan's wedding flooded the internet. Their grand ceremony dominated headlines. 7 out of the top 10 trending topics were about them. Out of curiosity, I opened a photo from the event. Lily, dressed in an extravagant wedding gown, leaned on Ryan's shoulder with a radiant smile. They looked every bit the perfect couple. But that massive wedding buzz was soon overshadowed by another explosive headline. Ethan Fu's father had collapsed suddenly and was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The news footage showed chaos outside the Fu family estate. Mr. Fu Sr. was being carried into an ambulance while Ethan's stepmother sobbed hysterically beside him, nearly fainting. Outside the emergency room, she leaned pale-faced against her younger son, tears streaking her cheeks. Facing the cameras, she wept silently while her son shouted furiously at reporters, "Go find Ethan Fu. Isn't he the one who loves the spotlight? He knew our father's health was fragile, but he still picked a fight with him. Now my father's lying in the hospital. Is he satisfied?" That accusation, combined with Ethan's usual public image, instantly set off an uproar. The internet exploded with outrage. Countless people sided with the grieving mother and son, condemning Ethan for driving his father to illness. And right in the middle of the storm, the news of my marriage to Ethan was exposed. Overnight, the narrative twisted. I became the conniving, illegitimate woman who had seduced him for money and inheritance. Reporters swarmed the studio. Cameras flashed like lightning, surrounding the entrance so tightly there was no escape. Even when I tried to slip out through the back door, they found me. "Look, it's Emily West," someone shouted. A dozen flashes went off at once, blinding me. Microphones shoved toward my face. "Emily, did you and Ethan Fu really get married? Is it true Mr. Fu's collapse was caused by your marriage? How will the Fu family's assets be divided? When Mr. Fu was hospitalized, witnesses say Ethan was partying at a nightclub with several women. Is that true?" They pressed closer until I was cornered against the wall. I had nowhere to go. So I reached forward, grabbed one reporter's microphone, and calmly read her badge. "Reporter Wang Ying," I said evenly, "did you personally see Ethan at that nightclub?" Her eyes flickered. "I didn't, but," I cut her off, my gaze sweeping over the crowd. "Then why report it as fact? As journalists, isn't your duty to seek truth and serve the public? Or do you just fabricate stories for clicks?" A sharp voice rose from the crowd. "Then why wasn't Ethan at the hospital while his father was being treated?" "Because he doesn't need to put on a performance to earn sympathy," I said without hesitation. Immediately, someone latched onto my words. "Are you implying that Mrs. Fu and her son are faking it for attention?" I gave a faint smile. "Those were your words, not mine." When they couldn't get a reaction out of me, they shifted tactics. "If that's the case, why attack your marriage? The internet says you and Ethan were never legally married, that you spread the rumor yourself to pressure him into acknowledging you, hoping to marry into the Fu family and seize the inheritance." I kept my tone steady. "Ethan and I have a confidentiality agreement. Our marriage wasn't meant for public disclosure." My silence only emboldened them. They pressed harder, their questions growing sharper, their voices rising. I could feel the heat of the cameras closing in, the weight of the crowd suffocating. I took a step back, then another, until I had nowhere left to retreat. And then, from behind the sea of reporters, a clear, steady male voice cut through the chaos. "Who said we're not married?" The noise stopped at once, heads turned. The crowd parted instinctively, making way. Ethan appeared, walking toward me through the press of people, his driver shielding him from the jostling reporters. The setting sun poured through the glass doors behind him, outlining his tall frame in golden light like a silhouette carved from strength. Every camera lens focused on him as he reached me. Without hesitation, he slipped an arm around my shoulders, pulling me close. His hand rested lightly but firmly on my back, a silent gesture of reassurance. I looked up at him. He met my gaze. His voice calm, yet powerful enough to silence the chaos around us. "Emily West is my wife, legally and rightfully married to me," Ethan said, his calm, steady voice carrying clearly over the noise. "She is the lawful young madam of the Fu family, recognized by the Civil Affairs Office." The image of the two of us standing together under the sunset, his arm around me, our eyes meeting, spread across the internet like wildfire. Public opinion instantly split in two. Some praised Ethan's boldness, calling him protective and sincere, saying maybe he wasn't the heartless playboy the tabloids made him out to be. Others accused him of putting on a show for attention. But to Ryan, who had just returned from his honeymoon, that same photo looked very different. He stared at the image on his phone, the one being reposted thousands of times, fixating on the expression in my eyes, the shock, the emotion, the faint trust. That gaze used to belong to him. Now I looked at him with cold indifference, yet I looked at the man he despised most with warmth and emotion. Crash! The coffee table went flying, sending shards of glass scattering. Lily flinched, startled. "Ryan, what's wrong?" she asked in confusion. He didn't answer. His rage had nowhere to go, caged and violent like a trapped beast ready to explode. His jaw clenched so tightly that his voice came out through gritted teeth. "She actually married him. Emily, how dare you?" The moment my name left his mouth, Lily's face darkened. She bent down to pick up his phone from the floor, the cracked screen still showing that same picture of Ethan and me. In an instant, she understood why Ryan was so furious. He was jealous. Lily, who had always been adored and coddled, had never felt such humiliation. Ryan had never truly loved her. Marrying her had only been his way of reclaiming the comfortable life he'd lost. Now that the wedding was over, he didn't even bother pretending. He yanked his hand out of hers coldly. "Stay out of my business," he said, already striding toward the door. Lily's temper snapped. She rushed in front of him, blocking his way. "Where are you going? It's our wedding night. Are you seriously leaving?" Her voice rose, trembling with disbelief. "You're going to her, aren't you? You're going to find Emily?" Ryan stopped, turning to look at his so-called wife. His eyes were icy, full of warning and impatience. "Where I go is none of your concern," he said flatly. "From now on, Lily, stay put in the Cooper house. Play your part as the respectable Mrs. Cooper. Everything else, stay out of it, understand?" She stood there shaking, her face contorted with fury as he walked out without a backward glance. Then, choking on rage and humiliation, she screamed after him, "You bastard!" After I moved into Ethan's house, I gradually got to know his driver, an older man with a gentle way of speaking. Through him, I began to learn about sides of Ethan that no one else ever mentioned. Every year, he made anonymous donations to orphanages and nursing homes. He loved animals, often volunteering at shelters for strays. He regularly donated to programs for the disabled, the elderly, and children left behind in rural areas, and he personally visited them whenever he could. He was also passionate about photography. Some of his works had even won awards, though few knew they were his. None of these good deeds were public knowledge. Yet, every rumor and scandal the media printed about the Fu family somehow ended up tied to his name. His younger brother got a woman pregnant, it was blamed on Ethan. His brother got into fights and gambling debts, it was blamed on Ethan. He tried explaining at first, but his father never believed him. Over time, the disbelief hardened into indifference, and Ethan gave up defending himself. The more people smeared him, the less he cared. If his father despised something, Ethan made a point of doing it, almost out of spite. Their relationship had long been hanging by a thread, and this time, that fragile bond finally snapped. Ethan's father didn't survive. He passed away in the ICU. The day of the funeral, Ethan didn't attend. The media called him unfilial. The internet tore him apart. But only I knew the truth. That day, he locked himself in his room and hadn't eaten or drunk anything from morning till night. The driver had knocked several times, but there'd been no response. I took the warm glass of milk from his hands. "I'll go," I said quietly. At the top of the stairs, I hesitated, then whispered through the door, "Ethan, I'm coming in." The room was completely dark. Only the moonlight spilling through the tall windows illuminated the floor, stretching his shadow long across the wall. He sat in the corner by the window, motionless, his back turned to me, his entire figure steeped in loneliness. I set the milk down on the table and walked to him softly, sitting beside him without a word. We didn't speak. We just sat there together, staring out into the silent, endless night. Silence lingered in the air, heavy and suffocating, until Ethan finally spoke first. His voice was hoarse. "You're not even going to tell me to mourn?" I gave a bitter smile. "That twisted relationship between you and your father, all those years of unfairness and emotional cruelty, already drained whatever feelings you had left for him. There's nothing left to mourn. I turned my head slightly, studying the faint outline of his face in the shadows. You're not sad because he died, I said softly. You're sad because of your mother, aren't you? You're wondering how she's doing now, if she's finally at peace, if she's let go of everything that hurt her, and if she ever saw your father again, what would she feel? Ethan stayed quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick, nasal, trembling. My mom, she was terrified of pain, but she still chose to slit her wrists. She stayed conscious the whole time, just lying there, watching her blood drain away. His voice broke, his shoulders began to tremble, his head bowed lower and lower. I thought, when he died I'd be glad, he whispered, that it would be his punishment, his karma. But I looked at his shaking shoulders and didn't try to comfort him with empty words. Instead, I quietly leaned closer, resting my shoulder against his. Ethan's head dropped gently onto me, his weight warm and heavy. Our mothers, I murmured, they were both good women, too good for the lives they were given. I hope, wherever they are, they've found peace, and someone who truly cherishes them in their next life. At that moment, a faint breeze slipped through the narrow window crack, brushing across the old wind chime hanging by the glass door. Its soft, crystalline notes rang through the stillness, clear, lingering, and hauntingly beautiful. 2 months after Ryan and Lily's grand wedding, disaster struck the Cooper family. A major construction project their company had built collapsed due to substandard materials, killing 3 workers. The scandal spread like wildfire. Competitors seized the opportunity to expose other hidden dealings, and soon every buried secret of the Coopers was dragged into the light. Ryan's father was taken away for investigation. The company's stock plummeted overnight, and bankruptcy followed, leaving them buried under massive compensation debts. Ryan couldn't accept it. He had cut me off, humiliated me, chosen his perfect life, and yet he still couldn't escape ruin. It didn't make sense to him. As for Lily, her dream of becoming a wealthy socialite barely lasted 2 months before crumbling. Unable to face the reality of financial ruin, she cried and screamed daily, demanding a divorce. My father, ever the opportunist, rushed to retrieve her from the Coopers' mansion, publicly severing ties to their downfall. When I saw Ryan again, the Coopers had already been declared bankrupt. His marriage was over. He was drunk, reeking of alcohol, unshaven and disheveled. When he showed up at my studio, the moment he saw me, he staggered forward and grabbed my wrist in a desperate grip. His glassy eyes were wild, confused. Why? He slurred. Why did it still turn out like this? It wasn't supposed to be like this. It wasn't supposed to be. He rambled, lost in his delusions, his words breaking apart. Then suddenly, he looked at me with an almost pitiful tenderness, his voice trembling. Emily, I never forgot you. I never loved Lily. I only married her because I thought it would make life easier. He kept talking, incoherent, pleading. I had this dream, a long one. In it, we ran away together. We were broke, always fighting, always blaming each other. I was scared we'd end up like that again. That's why I left you. You have to believe me. Watching him unravel, clinging to his self-deception, I no longer bothered to pretend. My voice was calm, cutting through the chaos. Ryan, I said, that wasn't a dream. That was our last life. He froze. His drunken gaze sharpened in an instant, disbelief washing over his face. The emotion, the guilt, the sorrow, all drained away, replaced by shock. I held his gaze, speaking each word clearly. From the moment you decided to marry Lily, I knew it. You were reborn too. For a long moment, Ryan just stared at me, his face pale, his expression vacant. Then slowly his features twisted in rage, the drunken haze vanished, replaced by fury. So, Emily, he shouted, his voice cracking, this was your plan all along? You never intended to be with me again, did you? You knew the Coopers would go bankrupt from the start. So that's it, huh? Ryan's voice trembled with anger. You turned around and chose someone richer, Ethan Fu. That's what this was all about, wasn't it? I didn't bother arguing. My tone was cold, detached. Ryan, whether in the past or in this life, the ending was always going to be the same. You brought this on yourself. You've always wanted something for nothing. But shortcuts never lead anywhere good. Just then, Ethan's car pulled up smoothly by the curb. I opened the door and slid inside without hesitation. Ryan, red-eyed and furious, tried to rush after me, but Ethan's driver stepped out quickly. blocking his path. The car glided away, leaving him standing on the street, drunk, desperate, and utterly lost. When we arrived at the Fu family estate, the atmosphere was heavy. Ethan had sent the driver to pick me up because his father's lawyer had announced the reading of the will. All family members were required to attend. In the grand living room, tension hung thick in the air. Ethan sat in the main seat, calm and composed. Across from him were his stepmother and her son, both wearing smug, expectant smiles, as though victory was already theirs. I quietly took a seat beside Ethan. The lawyer broke the seal on a thick envelope and began to read aloud. But when he announced that all corporate shares would go to Ethan, the stepmother's smile froze. And when the lawyer continued, explaining that the family estate would be divided at an 80-20 ratio in Ethan's favor, she shot to her feet, face pale with disbelief. "Impossible," she screamed. "This will is fake." Her voice was shrill, accusing. "You must have tampered with it, Ethan." Even Ethan looked taken aback. He frowned, glancing at the lawyer with genuine confusion. The lawyer adjusted his glasses and said evenly, "Mr. Fu, this is your father's handwritten letter, left to you before his death." Then he began to read. The letter revealed the truth Ethan's father had buried deep for years. He had never stopped caring for his eldest son. On the contrary, his strictness came from high expectations and guilt. He admitted that he had wronged Ethan's mother and that remorse had followed him for the rest of his life. As for his younger son, born of his second marriage, the father wrote bluntly that the boy was spoiled, lazy, and lacked ambition, completely unfit to inherit the family business. He confessed that his years of coldness toward Ethan were deliberate. It was to ease his wife's guard while also testing and hardening Ethan's will. "Business," he wrote, "is a battlefield. I needed a successor who has endured hardship, who can stand firm in any storm. Not a flower raised in a greenhouse." At the end of the letter, he offered Ethan a final apology. "When I see your mother again," it read, "I'll beg her forgiveness myself." By the time the lawyer finished, Ethan's stepmother and her son were ashen-faced. Their outrage soon turned to panic, and in the end, Ethan had them thrown out of the estate. With their departure, the bitter grudges of the previous generation finally came to an end. On my 26th birthday, I held my first solo art exhibition. The response exceeded every expectation. Critics and collectors alike praised my work. Even after the last guest had left, I couldn't bring myself to leave. Alone in the quiet hall, I walked slowly from one painting to the next, my steps echoing softly against the marble floor. And then, my breath caught. Hanging in the center of the exhibition, under a soft spotlight, was Spring Dawn, my mother's final masterpiece. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen. Joy swelled inside me, wave after wave, until it hit me. This painting was the reason I had first approached Ethan all those months ago. That night at the club, I'd stopped him, offering myself in exchange for this one piece of my mother's legacy. He had promised then that when our contract ended, Spring Dawn would be mine, which meant our arrangement was officially over. A dull ache bloomed in my chest, subtle but deep. Over these past 6 months, the boundaries between us had blurred. Little by little, I had come to love the quiet ways he cared for me, the cup of hot coffee he'd wordlessly hand me while I painted, the car waiting outside the studio on rainy days, the clumsy but heartfelt bowl of noodle soup he made when I was sick. He never said much, but everything he did spoke of quiet tenderness. "Your eyes are red," came his voice suddenly, soft and close beside me. "Have you been staring at the paintings too long?" Or, I turned around, startled, and before I could wipe it away, a tear slipped down my cheek. He noticed. His brow furrowed slightly as he stepped closer, holding something in his hand, the contract we had signed months ago. Without a word, under my gaze, Ethan tore it neatly in two. Then again, until the pieces fluttered to the floor like falling snow. "It's over," he said quietly. I nodded, but my heart felt anything but done. I forced myself to sound calm. "Yeah," I said softly. "Mr. Fu's gone now. Everything in the Fu family is back on track. Our fake marriage doesn't really serve a purpose anymore." My eyes drifted toward Spring Dawn, my mother's painting, glowing under the gallery lights. I smiled, trying to keep my tone light. "This piece is worth at least 5 million now. I'd say I didn't lose out too badly." Inside, my palms were clenched so tightly they hurt. Still, I smiled. You can decide when to finalize the divorce. I'll cooperate whenever you're ready." But Ethan only gave a quiet laugh. "Forget the paperwork," he said. "Getting remarried would be too much trouble later." Before I could process what he meant, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit and took out a small box. Inside was a ruby ring that shimmered under the light. "This belonged to my mother," he said softly. "She told me to give it to my future wife." His voice was steady, but his eyes, deep, dark, full of emotion, held something that made my heart race. "So, Emily West," he continued, "I'd like to make you another offer." My breath caught. "What kind of offer?" He smiled faintly. "My life, in exchange for yours. Will you take the deal?" For a moment, I couldn't move. Then a laugh escaped me, half sob, half disbelief. But the longer I laughed, the harder it became to stop the tears from falling. Putting on a brave smile, I held out my right hand. "The ring's beautiful," I said, voice trembling. Maybe I should try it on for a few days." Ethan's hands were shaking slightly as he took mine. Slowly, carefully, he slid the ruby ring onto my finger. I watched him, tears blurring my vision, my heart swelling with a mix of joy and peace. And then, without thinking, I threw myself into his arms. He caught me tightly, lifting me off the ground and spinning me around with unrestrained laughter. Behind us, the sunflowers in spring dawn seemed to glow brighter in the sunlight, smiling with us. The West family's downfall came soon after, dragged down by the collapse of the Cooper Company. My father, desperate for help, came to the Fu residence, pretending affection and humility. He smiled obsequiously and begged Ethan for financial aid. Ethan refused without hesitation. I stood beside him, my voice calm but firm. "I already announced publicly that I severed ties with you, remember? Whatever happens to the West family has nothing to do with me." My father's face twisted with anger. "Ungrateful girl," he shouted before the Fu family's security guards escorted him out. Having lost everything, he sold Lily off to a crippled young heir in exchange for a hefty dowry. Lily reportedly starved herself several times in protest, but in the end she still married him. After the wedding, she lived under her mother-in-law's constant scorn, enduring endless humiliation. My stepmother's health declined rapidly from the stress. Word eventually spread that she'd had a stroke and was bedridden. As for Ryan, karma finally caught up with him. He'd never had any real skills, just arrogance and laziness. When the Cooper name still meant something, he was surrounded by hangers-on and flatterers. But once the family fell, everyone disappeared. He couldn't even find a job. He came to my studio several times, drunk and disheveled, blocking the entrance to beg me for forgiveness. "Emily, I'm sorry," he said, voice breaking. "I was wrong. I'll change, I swear. Please come back to me. I'm so lost, so alone. My dad's in prison, my mom cries every day. I need you, Emily. Don't leave me. I know you don't really love Ethan. Please, come back." I looked at him quietly, then reached into my bag and handed him a folded medical slip. "Congratulations, Ryan," I said evenly. "I'm going to be a mother." After that day, he never came again. Later, gossip spread that Ryan had tried to pursue Lily again. Out of curiosity, Ethan had someone look into it and discovered that the rumor had been started by Lily herself. But during that same investigation, Ethan came across a photograph taken years ago at my family home. I was in the corner of the frame, young, defiant, my chin lifted just slightly. He told me later, "The first moment I saw that photo, I couldn't look away. That girl's eyes, they reminded me of myself." I smiled at him, teasing gently. "So, Ethan Fu, you fell in love with me at first sight?" He chuckled. "Something like that," he said softly. "Yeah, I guess I did." Years later, as sunlight spilled into my studio, I stood before Spring Dawn, the painting that had started it all. Behind me, Ethan's arms slipped around my waist, his familiar warmth anchoring me to the moment. The past, with all its pain and chaos, had finally settled into quiet peace. We'd both lost too much, fought too hard, but somehow found each other at the end of it all. I turned to him and smiled. We made it. He kissed my forehead, whispering against my skin, "This time for a lifetime." And outside the window, the sunflowers in bloom turned their faces toward the light, just like us.